The difference between a tragic story and a redemption story is allowing the story to run for a few more pages. That's it, unless your hero dies, in which case, make them so awesome that they can walk off a gigantic sword through all of their major organs for the third time in a row. Whereas a tragic story ends with a hero succumbing to their internal flaw, such as self-loathing, a redemption arc has to do with a character finding some reason to keep pushing forward and persevering, despite their flaws. The God of War Norse duology gave Kratos a reason to keep going, not to avenge himself, not to hate himself further, but rather to protect his son from becoming the god killer Kratos once was, requiring the ghost of Sparta to accept that he could change, even if his past cannot. The God of War Valhalla DLC then pulls the final stitch in Kratos' redemption arc through to a close by taking a closer look at his original Greek tragedy, reminding our audience that changing for the better doesn't excuse the mistakes of our past, but that the mistakes of our past give us an opportunity to change for the better. It's not a rewriting or reframing of Kratos' story. It is the writers, unfortunately, needing to hold some of our hands in an attempt to show players that Kratos was always complex. As Kratos states at the end of the DLC,
"But you are more than that. You have always been more than what others saw."
this was evident going into the duology. We saw our god killer as a quiet recluse instead of his usual bombastic, blades a-blazing at the gates self. He's withdrawn from his son. He is strict but reserved. He is fighting trolls just as hard as he is fighting with himself. And, while this change in expression is obvious, it is not a change in who Kratos has always been. A man struggling to forgive himself so that he can take on the burden of leadership, fatherhood, and possibly godhood. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. God of War Valhalla explores Kratos' past in a more direct manner than the previous two games of the duology. Part of the fun of the first Norse game is in knowing Kratos' past, while Atreus is none the wiser about who his father is. This irony is compelling for advancing the story with tension, because we understand Kratos' internal conflict while Atreus does not. And while we come to better understand Kratos' apprehensions about being a role model for his son, we never spend an incredible amount of time understanding Kratos after the events of God of War 3, and his apprehensions about existing in the world beyond himself. Who is Kratos now? What are his thoughts about his past? And has he truly changed, or has he only changed out of fear for his son's well-being? Sure, in Helheim we get to see Kratos kill Zeus again, which is probably the greatest sin he committed in terms of increasing his apprehensions about fatherhood. However, this is not the greatest crime Kratos committed over the course of the trilogy, and I doubt that it was among one of his greatest regrets. What a lot of us old game nerds have forgotten since we were 9 years old and definitely should not have been allowed to play the original God of War is that Kratos had spent 10 years pursuing relief from his memories. The man didn't want Zeus murdered. He didn't want to kill everyone he ever knew on Olympus. He pretty much only wanted to forget what he had done, and to exact his revenge against Ares. Then things got a little out of hand. What God of War Valhalla allows for is a brief aside where we take the camera focus off of the world of Norse mythology and off Kratos' relationship to his son, Freya, Tyr, and the gang, in order to place it back on Kratos and his past. After all the supposed growth Kratos has undergone since making himself into a kebab, Has the man grown enough to reclaim the throne as a god of war? The Valhalla story focuses on 4 acts from the original trilogy: killing Helios, his deal with Ares, opening Pandora's box the first time, and the Chamber of Sacrifice, while also taking brief moments to focus on Kratos' relationship to his wife, daughter, Pandora, and the ship captain. These reminders of past mistakes are not too unlike the scrawled notes Kratos finds in Hades during the third God of War, mementos of his past mistakes and grievances that Kratos has never forgiven himself for. It's important to draw a parallel between these 2 instances, because we are looking at the difference between what makes a tragedy and what makes a redemption story. In both Valhalla and the original trilogy, Kratos' number 1 villain has always been himself. The difference between the 2 outcomes is our hero's ability to accept the actions of his past, and Tyr and Valhalla itself help facilitate this change by showing Kratos that his choices were never as cut and dry as the man himself believed. Yes, he hated Ares for tricking him, but he hated himself more for killing his own family. The last battle in God of War is literally protecting Kratos' family from a swarm of doppelgangers. The man genuinely loved his family more than I think the original games had time to articulate, but this is pretty darn good. In the sequel, Kratos hated the gods for not granting him release from his memories, but he hated himself for the crimes he could not undo even more. And sure, Zeus sucked, but after watching Kratos brutally murder everyone in the third game, it was almost okay for Zeus to suck, because Kratos was despicably evil by game's end. In all 3 games, what matters a lot is that Kratos has always hated himself more than anyone or anything else. In fact, he's hated himself way before we as audience members ever have. This is one of the phenomenal feats of the original trilogy. The game gets us to sympathize with our hero by the very end, not in wanting relief or revenge, but for what Kratos truly felt, which was a hatred for himself. It's the same hatred he had for himself at the start of Game 1, a hatred we could not yet understand as he stepped off the bluffs in hopes of ending his life. It is a decision which we finally come to appreciate by the end of the third game, after we see a monster as well as a man. So how then did the storytellers develop a deeper change within Kratos that wasn't established in the duology? The Norse duology provided an intimate change where Kratos, having killed his father and also having grown to despise all gods, must now be a father to his son, who is, likewise, a god. There is a considerable amount of inner turmoil with this conundrum, and it puts Atreus' life at stake. If Kratos can't get over his own hang-ups, his son is either going to die from a coughing fit, or grow into a resentful psycho like Baldur. Valhalla enhances the scope of Kratos' choices. Much in the same way Kratos is afraid to touch Atreus after his birth, Kratos is afraid to assume the throne as the new God of War. It's the same predicament, just on a larger scale. Sure, Kratos has proven that he can be a considerably awesome dad, but he had to be a better father for his son. And what I mean by this is, Atreus was already born. The burden of responsibility is already there. The question in Valhalla is, should Kratos take on the responsibility of godhood in service to the 9 realms, despite the actions of his past? And this question, this story, is heavy because we've seen Kratos at his worst. We've disliked or even hated Kratos at his worst. The fear is not in letting some guy assume the throne of God of War. The fear is in letting this guy become the God of War. With that in mind, we've also seen profound humanity in Kratos' character, namely in the case of his wife, daughter, Pandora, and the killing of Athena. Whereas some of us might remember Kratos as a bloodthirsty lunatic from the original trilogy, Valhalla reminds us that Kratos loved his wife, even though he was too naive to fully appreciate or care for her. In Chains of Olympus, Kratos forgoes what time he would have left with Calliope in order to save the world. A heartbreaking choice when it happened initially, but all the more heartbreaking when we consider that Kratos eventually ends up killing everyone in Greece anyway, and found no relief from it. At least, had he stayed in Elysium, he might have had some short moment of happiness. Before Pandora sacrificed herself, Kratos reached out towards her the same way he reached out to Atreus in the new games. Athena's accidental murder signified the death of Kratos' last pseudo-friend. The boat captain was a recurring Easter egg in every game of the trilogy, sometimes played for laughs, but 24 years later, the scene is hauntingly cold, and it still bothers Kratos right up there with the deaths of his family members. This depth to Kratos' character was always present in the original trilogy, and the events were set up in a way that made sense for Kratos' original tragic end. The man had made some doozies just in his personal life, let alone the lives of pretty much everyone else in the world. And while the duology gave us an opportunity to see Kratos come to terms with his daddy issues and parenting pitfalls, it did not have the chance to explore godhood, or, more relevant to a mortal audience, the need to be in service to something greater than oneself. While so far I've focused on the aspects of Valhalla which emphasized Kratos' personal life, the major focus of Valhalla are the events of Kratos' past which had larger implications for the world at large, implications which were more complex than they appear at a glance. Yeah, sure, he swore an oath to Ares so he could beat the barbarians, but defeating the invaders meant protecting Sparta from all those fun things people do when invading, like fires, death, being not so nice to the boundaries of women and children. You know, that stuff. Yes, Kratos killed Helios and plunged the world into darkness so he could have a flashlight. But there was also a time where Kratos sacrificed himself to save Helios and replace the sun in the sky. This would mark the second time Kratos sacrificed his wants for the good of the world. Sure, he opened Pandora's box so that he could get revenge. No, he didn't know what would happen to the rest of the world when he opened it. Sure, he probably would have opened it anyways, as Helios states, because Kratos really wanted to practice making people into shish kebabs before trying it out on himself. But he also eventually released hope into the world. Okay, so admittedly this one is a little convoluted in my eyes. I feel like opening the box the second time, sacrificing Pandora, killing Hephaestus, and sleeping with Hephaestus' wife would have been a more impactful story bit, but whatever, 3 out of 4 isn't that bad. So, finally, the Chamber of Sacrifice. Kratos was pretty heartless in this level. I mean, they had to change this scene in the UK release because it was too traumatic to burn the Athenian soldier alive. That's wild. But what's pretty cool about this story focus, and why I saved it for last, is because the story doesn't justify or try to rationalize the action. The next phase of Valhalla doesn't reveal itself when Kratos attempts to burn Helios. Instead, it only opens up when Kratos decides to sacrifice himself in the cage, place the pain and burden upon his own shoulders, making the hard choice to suffer and struggle instead of allowing someone else to suffer in his place. Ooh, symbolism. To me, why this digression into Kratos' past is the most important is because it highlights what godhood truly is: a life in sacrifice and service. It isn't solely a position of power. True leadership is the willingness to do what you ask of your subjects. True leadership is the willingness to put yourself in harm's way before letting someone else carry the burden. Stepping into the cage is symbolically what Kratos must be willing to do in taking up the throne as God of War. He is not feeding a soldier to the fire. He is not putting his burden on someone he finds annoying, like Helios, just so he can avoid the pain and responsibility. He is taking the suffering upon himself, both the blame for what has happened and the sacrifice necessary to move forward. This self-sacrifice, this truthful self-reflection, are what God of War Valhalla needed to establish for Kratos' story to come full circle. It is what our young Kratos lacked, a willingness to look at himself and say, I goofed up, this is my fault and I need to accept what I've done before I can move forward. The storytellers remind us that he was not just a god killer. He was not just a merciless, vengeful god. He was a complex character, riddled with grief and misguided decisions, blinded by rage at everyone around him, when his struggle was always within himself, with what he had become. Valhalla helps its audience see how Kratos' choices were never straightforward or easy, that his actions were often misguided but never simple, that the man we see now is no longer the ghost of Sparta, because instead of Helios and Athena to torture him, Kratos now has Mimir, Tyr, and Freya for support. That Kratos, the once tragic character incapable of forgiving himself, can come full circle, can accept the actions of his past, can carry their burden, and take the throne as the new God of War.